Defiance and solidarity in Belgium. Thousands gather to remember those killed and injured in Tuesday's suicide bombings. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. A major development in the Brussels terror attacks. The person who authorities believe made the bombs in both the Brussels and Paris attacks is now believed to be dead. At least 31 people were killed and more than 270 were injured when 3 suicide bombs were detonated Tuesday at the Brussels airport and a metro station. Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the attacks. A Belgian prosecutor says 4 men carried out the attacks and 1 suspect remains at large. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Kate Parkinson. She joins us from Brussels. And Kate, what more can you tell us on the investigation?
Well, absolutely. We've had some major developments here in Brussels. On Wednesday, 3 of the 4 attackers have now been named. Investigators said 2 of them were brothers, Ibrahim and Khalid Bakauri. One of them blew himself up on the metro train, the other at the airport just behind me. A second airport suicide bomber was also named, this time not by official sources, it was off the record, so we have to be a little bit careful about this information, but unnamed counterterrorism officials, intelligence officials are saying that Najim Lashouri also committed suicide, blew himself up in this terrorist act at the airport. Now, this is particularly interesting because we've been hearing his name a lot in the past few days. Belgian authorities had already identified him as being the suspected bomb maker, not only making the bombs for the Brussels attacks, but also making the explosives that were used in November in the Paris terror attack. So this is a particularly interesting development. There is a 4th attacker, the 3rd man that was seen at the airport. He is on the run and there is a massive manhunt underway.
Kate, Belgian security forces arrested Salah Abdeslam last week. Now, he was wanted in connection with the November Paris attacks. Were these men associated with him?
It is certainly looking that way. As the investigation has unravelled in the past day or so, we have had more and more clues indicating that they were part of the same cell, the same terror group. Firstly, for example, the DNA from Lashouri was found in flats that were used by the Paris attackers. So already we have that link with this individual and Salah Abdeslam. We also understand that one of the brothers that I just mentioned had used a fake ID to rent a flat, which police raided while they were hunting for Abdeslam. He wasn't there when they raided it, but his DNA was found there. So yet again, we're seeing another link. In fact, some sources are saying that maybe Salah Abdeslam was meant to take part in these Brussels attacks, but they were brought forward following his arrest. Now, certainly from a security point of view, this does rather mitigate the current threat because it does indicate that they were part of the same terrorist cell, and that does indicate that perhaps there is not another active cell operating here in Brussels at the moment, which is what many feared was the case when the attacks took place on Tuesday.
Right, and what is the security situation in the city right now?
Well, understandably, the security situation remains very high. The country's threat level remains at its absolute highest, which does mean that there is still an imminent danger of an attack. Police are carrying out raids across the city. They are looking for this one attacker who is on the run, looking for other individuals who may be linked to the group and who may pose a threat. During one raid, they found a makeshift bomb factory with some 15 kilos of explosives. That address was thought to be the launch pad of Tuesday's attacks. It just illustrates how much more damage they could have done. But having said that, life does feel like it's starting to get back to normal. Public transport is running again now, for example, having been immediately shut down in the aftermath of the attacks, although the airport, which is just behind me, will remain closed until at least the weekend.
Thanks, Kate. That's CCTV's Kate Parkinson reporting from Brussels. Joining us now from Berlin via Skype is Julie Lenars. She is the founder and executive director of the Human Security Center in the United Kingdom. Here with us in Washington, D.C. is Saba Ahmed. She is the president and founder of the Republican Muslim Coalition. She's just returned from a trip to Brussels. From Paris, we're joined by Lila Jacinto. She's an international news reporter with France 24. And we're joined here in the studio by Rebecca Zimmerman. She's an associate policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Saba, let me start with you. You just returned from Brussels. You met with some of the Muslim community there. What can you tell us about that community?
Well, the Muslim community in Europe generally is on the front lines fighting terrorism. I think most Muslims are very upset about the horrible tragedies. They are working really hard with law enforcement to identify suspects or to work with the law enforcement. I was at the Grand Mosque of Paris where we had the French army policing the mosques, and I was very surprised to see that, but I think that's the general sentiment all across Europe, is that law enforcement is inside a lot of the mosques and they are monitoring severely, and sadly these people got away, but we hope that this is the end of it.
Julie, there is a belief, and we're getting this from the reports that are coming out of Brussels, that this was a major intelligence failure on the part of the Belgian security services. There is one report which says that Turkey, in fact, expelled one of those bombers. He was deported to the Netherlands. A warning was issued to the Netherlands as well as to Belgium that this particular individual was a militant. What do we know about that?
Well, it would certainly fit the pattern of what we've seen in the past, because it is no secret at all that the Belgian security service is ill-equipped and massively undersized in personnel. They cannot monitor all the people they actually should be monitoring, because let's not forget, Belgium has the highest per capita of foreign fighters in the entire European Union. We're looking at 500 to 700 people here. And given the personnel of the Belgian Secret Service, they perhaps can monitor 25 or 30% of the people active. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if these brothers actually slipped through the security net.
Lila, there's been speculation that this group in Brussels is tied to the attacks in Paris as well. What do we know about that?
Well, you know, the links are emerging more and more, and you know, Anand, I'm really reluctant to use the word cells anymore, because from what we have gathered so far, it seems to be a network, and this network is really just buddies. These are people. The only person that we know for sure so far is who went to Syria, who managed to get into Syria, was Abdelhamid Abaoud, who planned the Paris attacks. I haven't seen any evidence that Salah Abdeslam, who's the Paris attack suspect, now in custody, actually made it to Syria. So what we are seeing really is, you know, one returnee from Syria just getting his buddies together, and it's really an extension of criminal networks. You know, we keep talking a lot for the past 2 years about radicalization, but from this network, what we are seeing is a history, a pattern of petty criminals who have simply taken on this new cloak of radicalization. They don't particularly know Islam. They do not even know jihad, its theories or its theology. All of these people have criminal backgrounds, and they were known to the security services. The question, of course, is how come these plots were not thwarted, and why in such a tiny country like Belgium, where a lot of these people come from one district of Brussels, there just wasn't the sort of intelligence to break these links, this network earlier.
Rebecca, Lila raises a good point there. If these are crimes and these are criminals, you look at the authorities attaching words like terrorist and terrorism to it. You get the French Prime Minister calling this a war. It's kind of using military terms here. I mean, can this war be won? And wouldn't it be better to treat these people as criminals rather than attach these ideological and political labels to it?
Well, this is a debate you see often in the world of counterterrorism. Should it be approached as a law enforcement or as a military problem? And I think, you know, it's difficult because it is a bit of both. These are, as Leila said, people with criminal backgrounds. At the same time, clearly the banner under which they're acting and the message that's being spread is one of jihad. It's a message of the Islamic State. So I think there's maybe a little bit of differentiation that needs to happen more so than it does currently in the counterterrorism policies. But you know, as you said before, Belgium particularly, but a lot of Western Europe, these are places where these countries are extremely stressed, particularly with personnel, trying to actually man and cover down on all of these issues. So whether it's treated as law enforcement, whether it's treated as military, in some ways military actually gives them a little more manpower to deal with the problem. Now, it's not appropriate in a lot of these contexts, unfortunately, to militarize the problem, to militarize neighborhoods and things like that. But seeing it as purely law enforcement, they're having a lot of trouble, frankly, just recruiting people into law enforcement to work on this problem.
And that problem we have seen in Brussels. Sabo, what do you believe leads to the radicalization of young Muslims in a place like Brussels?
I think, as Leila said, these are criminals. These are petty criminals who have taken on this cause. But this is not Islamic jihad. This is not jihad that means to struggle for God. This is not, they're not following any real teachings of Islam. They're perverting the teachings of Islam to commit violent crimes, and they should be dealt with as criminals and mass murderers. I think law enforcement would be wise to monitor a lot of the petty criminals and keep an eye on whatever they're up to long after they've been released.
Right, but if they are criminals, what's the motive behind their actions if they're not driven by ideology or religious belief?
Well, like she said, they're not motivated by Islam because Islam strongly condemns taking of innocent life.
Right.
Killing of innocent human beings is completely against the basic teachings of Islam. So if they were really good Muslims, they wouldn't be doing such atrocity, because most of the people who died were not fighting in war. They were misusing laws of war to commit violent crimes. And like she said, they hardly know Islam, they hardly know jihad. This is just something that they've taken on. And it's sad to see our presidential candidates call it jihad and call it war and all kinds of other ideological labels, but these are criminals that should be monitored all across Europe. If they happen to be Muslim, they are obviously not being very good Muslims, and we shouldn't blame the whole religion for their crimes.
All right. Julie, what do you make of the fact that...
If I may.
Go ahead, Leila.
You know, the French political theorist Olivier Roy, very respected, puts it really well. He says the phenomenon is not the radicalization of Islam, it's the Islamization of radicalism. There is no radicalism in the market right now. There's no leftist radicals, you know, there's no Soviet Union. This is the new radicalism. So I completely agree that, you know, to misconstrue it this way, and also this needs to be seen in a European context. You know, this is a global phenomenon, but what we are seeing in Europe, what's happening in Europe is very much a second-generation immigration issue that's criminal and not Islamic.
All right. Julie, let's get back to the Brussels attacks. What do you make of the fact that the people who were targeted were people at an airport, people at a subway station? I mean, these are the softest of soft targets. What's the point of it?
Well, first of all, I would like to say something to your previous point. I think I would absolutely disagree that this is just a criminal act, and that I think it's absolutely irresponsible to deny any link whatsoever to the religion here. I don't think we're doing us any favor whatsoever if we are still in denial. I mean, these people, they murdered in the name of a religion, in the name of an ideology. That doesn't mean that all Muslims are criminals, that all Muslims are terrorists or potential terrorists, not at all. But there is a problem within Islam. Many of these groups, they are Salafist terrorist organizations. This is a part of Islam, and you can deny that, but this is a part of Islam. And if you look at countries like Saudi Arabia, if you look at countries like Pakistan, where they are killing people for leaving Islam or stoning women for adultery, this is part of Islam. And we have to talk about these things. Islam is a set of beliefs. And if some of these beliefs are harmful, then we must have the right to criticize them.
Lina,
Right, but there's a difference between Salafism and nihilism, you know.
That's what I said.
There are extreme grades. Right, and
That's what I
conservative
said.
Islam is not necessarily nihilistic Islam.
Being misused by a lot of these people. To call them ambassadors of Islam is the worst thing, that they're hijacking the religion of Islam. I think ISIS is not any more Islamic than KKK was Christian. You can't compare extremists and have them represent the religion. The religion strongly condemns all forms of terrorism, and you should go to the large, vast majority of Muslims who are very much against such criminal atrocities and use them against such violence. I mean, these people need to know what they're doing is completely un-Islamic, and they will be held accountable. If not in this world, they will be in the next time.
all right, Lina, I just want to get to the point on how this can be stopped. Whether this is driven by ideology or religion, or whether it's just criminal intent, what can you tell us about the relationship between these Muslim minority groups in places like Brussels or Paris and the police?
Well, in the Brussels, it's rather different. You know, France has a long history of its Muslim immigrants. It goes back to the colonial period. Belgium, this really just goes back to the 60s, you know, the post-war economic boom. And Belgium does not have a history of this. So the immigrant, you know, the first generation that came in was extremely happy to you know, for the economic well-being that they had in Europe. The second generation did not. And Belgian authorities pretty much let that be, were not able to see the early warning signs, which incidentally came from members of the community. You know, this is another tragedy that tends to happen, and it gets exacerbated now that the rhetoric of Islamophobia is happening. So a lot of the left liberals who should be paying attention to these alerts that are coming from within the community are so scared of having an Islamophobic labeling that these warnings were not heeded. There are very few community polices in an area like Molenbeek, and you know, and you know, this. For the past 2 years, we've been hearing about there are not enough of security services to manage this problem. There are not enough of Arabic speakers in the intelligence services. You know, these kind of excuses just cannot fly anymore. France and Belgium have a lot of Arabic speakers, and you know, these things need to be addressed.
Right, Rebecca,
another thing,
yeah.
you know, right.
I'll get back to you, Rebecca. I just want to,
another thing is
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Rebecca, Belgium has more citizens per capita fighting in Syria right now than any other country. Why Belgium?
I think, you know, part of it is question of the community there, and I think, you know, certainly I think there are a number of people here who could speak to kind of the attitudes of the community and the deep roots of the community, but part of it is also, I think, an ease of movement issue. And so, you know, the facilitation pipelines sometimes just run easier to certain places, but there's an element of it that is, as we've said, sort of this first generation, not the immigrant generation, but the first generation that's born in a particular place that doesn't feel like they've been able to succeed in being accepted into the culture of the country, the economy of the country, and so forth. And so perhaps that's a contributing factor.
I mean, you say ease of movement. There are no borders between the countries of the European Union right now. Mm-hmm. So you can cross borders without a passport or anything like that, can you? Mm-hmm. Saba, one of the suspects in the Paris attacks, who was on the run for many months, he was an individual who was on the run. He hid in a community, or as we've been hearing, he hid in plain sight. He was getting support from that community, even if it was tacit support. What does that tell us about the community that was, in effect, protecting him?
Well, obviously, the community probably didn't know that he was behind the Paris attacks, or he wouldn't have gotten any type of support. So
his picture was all over the place.
Right, but I think, you know, I'm sure he was a criminal mastermind, and the law enforcement, it took them 4 or 5 months before they got to him. So I don't think the community should be blamed per se. They could have helped more, maybe, but I think, like I said, this is an intelligence failure on the Belgian law enforcement and the French police. They were monitoring everybody in France, but Belgium's right next to it. I mean, it was kind of obvious that they should have looked into all over Europe for the suspects of the Paris attacks, and it's sad to see them striking the European Union capital, but I hope that the law enforcement would be going after such suspects.
Does it also tell us that the community is perhaps so alienated from law enforcement authorities that they did not come forward?
Right, and they should have had like law enforcement, like undercover agents within the community, or they should have had some sort of other surveillance within the community to point this out. But it's sad to see that's a bigger problem that we have in terms of our intelligence failure, in terms of getting inside the community. Here in the United States, we have many Muslim American communities who are who partner with law enforcement all the time. So I don't expect such an atrocity or someone like that to be able to find refuge in any community here. But I would like to see that all over the world, and hope mostly in Europe. I think we need to step up our security efforts to make sure that none of these ISIS types attacks take place again.
I think there are just two other things with respect to why it took so long to find Salah Abdeslam. One is, you have to remember, this is a place that he had lived for a long time, French national, but had lived for a long time in Molenbeek. So to say the community at large is, I think, overly broad, but to say that he had probably very deep, very personal connections, I think is probably quite true. But the other is that there was failure after failure from the Belgian authorities really in trying to find him. I mean, there's evidence that suggests that they were minutes away from having found him several weeks ago when they actually raided the house where they found his fingerprints. So, you know, some of it is him being protected, but some of it is also weaknesses in the effort to find him.
All right. Julie, I want to ask you about something that Leila raised earlier on. You know, the Belgian authorities are telling us right now that there are up to 800 jihadists, they call them that, operating in the country, 85 of them believed to be in this Brussels inner city area of Molenbeek. And the mayor of that particular commune or municipality in Brussels tells us that there are only 4 policemen in his force that's dedicated to fighting what he called radicalism. Across the whole police force in Brussels, there are very, very few Arabic speakers on their security forces. And when one looks at those facts, I mean, are these forces capable of keeping people safe?
No, not at all. Not at all. And that's why it's not the first time that the Belgian security services have failed their duty. I mean, this is a problem people like myself have pointed out for quite a long time, because Belgium didn't emerge as sort of the capital of the jihadist movement in Europe overnight. This has been going on for quite a while, and it's not a coincidence that they've chosen that place. They are well aware of the weak nature of the Belgian state as such, and also of the very poorly equipped Belgian security services. So this is a very deep, long-term structural problem, and they need to address that, because they are actually putting all of us in danger by not stepping up the game.
Leila, I want to read you something that was in Time magazine. Time magazine reports that, talking about the situation in Brussels, it says, there is a poverty gap. Particularly vulnerable are the city's large foreign-born communities, members of which often feel trapped in a downward cycle of poor education and low social mobility. More than 30% of the population is foreign-born, concentrated on the north and west side of the city in the Molenbeek, Saint-Josse and Schaerbeek communes, unquote. Now that is a very apt description, isn't it? Would it surprise you to learn that that was written in June of 2010?
Not at all. You know, and Belgium's links or footprint on terror attacks goes back 15 years to Afghanistan. However, you know, it's also interesting if you look at who are the people named so far from the Muslim community. Brussels and Belgium's Muslim community, predominantly Moroccan and Turkish. And we are seeing far more Moroccans, people of Moroccan origin, signing up for, this latest radicalization, much more than Turkey. Turkey has done a job of providing their own imams for the communities here. This is another thing that we need to see. A lot of these Muslim communities are actually served by foreign imams, and sometimes they are not that monitored. Also, the sort of migration that took place from Morocco were really from this area of the Rif, which is northern Morocco. They've had an old history of rebelliousness to the authorities. So when you see someone like Abdel Salah being protected by his friends, this is really just an extension of what you would see, for instance, in the tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I know you, I have a loyalty to you, and I will protect you regardless of whether you are wanted by the law or not. So, these kind of things really need to be understood and examined.
Rebecca, I'd love to get your take on this, and this is just a theory that's been floated around. Syria, according to an op-ed piece in the Washington Post, is the 14th Muslim country that has been either invaded, bombed, or occupied by the United States since 1980. And there are also some analysts who say that countries like Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq have been completely destroyed in these bombings. Does that have anything to do with the radicalization of young Muslims?
It has something to do with the rhetoric that's used to radicalize young Muslims. I think certainly all you have to do is look at the publications, look at social media, and see what's out there. But that's nothing new, and that really, frankly, predates a lot of these events. And it's not strictly the U.S. You'll see rhetoric related to Chechnya, even at one point in time, the southern Philippines against the Filipino government. So universally, it's grievances that are used to radicalize. So I think that's absolutely true that it's being used. I think there's also certainly the element of experiences of people there that in a global world are so easily transferable outside of those countries, either because people know each other personally and make phone calls to diaspora communities, or because they see it on television, they see it on social media. So there is the sort of coverage of these issues that keeps it in the forefront of people's minds and certainly in the forefront of people's imaginations. I think it's absolutely used as a tool. Now, whether that affects U.S. policy and how the U.S. should manage these, that's another issue. That's a foreign policy decision, and whether there are negative externalities of military campaigns, that's certainly the case that there are.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. For continuing coverage of the Brussels terror attacks, turn to cctv-america.com. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.